Welcome back to the Integrate Intelligently podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Brickler, accompanied by founder and CEO and my brother, Scott Brickler. Scott, it's great to see you today. We have some new digs, new area. So what's going on?
We're actually in the same location. It's just sometimes easier to record separately in separate rooms. We're actually in a nice apartment here in Kelowna, BC, in Canada. So we're on the road again. Hopefully, last trip for a little while, so before the end of the year. But we're excited to be here. We're here for some coaching this week, and then working together on some planning and things like that. But it's good to get together and talk about this really cool topic this week.
So yeah, we've been last episode we were on the road, and it seems like we've been on the road quite a bit the last 4 to 6 weeks. So I'll be glad to finalize the travel and get back to the day-to-day work. But good to be here again with another podcast. This week's podcast, I think, is about ERP and how your ERP can be holding you back. So really digging into, I mean, obviously CAD Talk, as folks have been watching us and listening, is CAD Talk's an integration platform between engineering systems and ERP. And so we have a tremendous amount of experience with various ERP systems. And so there are common kind of mistakes or common issues that we see with every ERP system is kind of universal. Not so much about the tool, but I think, how your ERP system can holding you back, causing, issues that you might have in the business. And today's topic is really talk around why that might be, how to leverage an ERP system, talking about data integrity and that sort of thing. What are your thoughts, kind of initial thoughts, Scott? You've been working in ERP since I think what 98? I think you said you first started your first experience in a manufacturing company working with ERPs. What is your experience? What are your thoughts on ERP systems and holding a business back or causing being the success or tied to the success of a business?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the ERP, I mean, it's a fantastic tool. I mean, it really can help you run your manufacturing company and run your business better. But I think it's like a lot of technology. I mean, the technology is only as good as the process or the data that which you're working, right? So the biggest thing that could hold you back is like you could. I think a lot of people get into the idea that they can buy a tool and the problem goes away, but that's just really where the work begins. That's where the work begins. So the tool could help you, give you a reason or a project from which to make an improvement, but without the improvement, the tool kind of doesn't really work. I mean, it was like I think Bill Gates said, if you apply automation to a bad process, you just do a lot of bad things faster, which is typically what happens a lot of times when you apply the tool. So a lot of times what holds you back is a lack of process or a lack of data, the correct data in which to use the tool completely. And also a misunderstanding of the tool's job, like an ERP's job and what business size and what business problems that tool fixes. I mean, everyone has a little bit of different flavors to it and what they're better at, what they're worse at, and things like that. I think one of the things that's really interesting is that a lot of companies, when they kind of graduate to different levels of size, they get bigger tools and they think that the tool is actually going to be more efficient or it's actually going to make things faster. And actually, in some areas of the business, the tool will actually be slower than it was when they were what they were using before. So like a great example of that is like QuickBooks. If you're using QuickBooks is really, really good at running a small business, and it's really optimized around making certain operations very, very fast, and not with a lot of, like, if you're a small business, you're not going to have a huge accounting department. You're not going to have all these different functions that you would in a larger business. So it's been really streamlined to do invoicing and things that you do commonly in a small business really, really fast. But those same operations in like an SAP could take 2 or 3 people to do. And that seems counterintuitive for a lot of companies because they're like, well, how could it possibly, if I'm spending, 100 times more for this software, how does it take more people to run it? And I think that's the part that's counterintuitive, is that you're actually spending, the product can do more things, but with more flexibility becomes more complexity. And that complexity adds a lot more overhead to it. So you have to kind of, anytime you're weighing out like a software solution, you have to look at like, what problem am I trying to solve, and how much, and what is that complexity versus flexibility trade-off that you're trying to get when you're making that evaluation.
Yeah, so it sounds like, you got to right size the tool for what you're trying to achieve with your size of your business, the problems that you're trying to solve. It's not just picking whichever, like any of them are all the same. They each have their strengths, and they each can do the tasks that you need or solve the problems that you have, but it has to be the right size, right? So just like if you think about very specific tools like for like construction, right? You don't need a sledgehammer to drive a nail.
Exactly. And I think we see a lot of people run into is they have like big aspirations for the future, and then they kind of overbuy, which is like, I think all my ERP reseller friends would hate me saying this, but it's true. It's like they buy a package sometimes a little bit more than they think they need because they're like, well, we can grow into that, and sometimes you can. But I think it's better because implementing one of these systems is a huge can be a huge undertaking, and they're always kind of like people are trying to they don't want to go through it again, right? So they're thinking of the future, and I'm like, this thing's going to be nasty to do. I don't want to do it again in 5 years when we outgrow it. But I would challenge that. I think that you get to look at like, are you sure you're going to get there? And if you have a good process and you have a good data, I think the changeover is probably even if you have to change over in 5 years or 6 years or whatever, you're better off kind of doing that stair step method. At least that's my opinion. And we've seen that with a lot of companies, is that you're better kind of stepping into each level so you can kind of grow as your company grows with the complexity of the software you're looking to buy. And I think that sometimes people will kind of overbuy and they'll skip levels, and then they struggle a lot, and then they end up, sometimes they have failed implementations, or they got a bad taste in their mouth about the tools and things like that. And then that usually ends up being a lot of struggle. And a lot of ERP implementations fail. I think a lot of them come with the fact that people didn't understand the complexity they were getting into because the tool may have not been sized correctly for their problem. And then they spent a lot of money getting the tool, and then the tool didn't really save them the dollars because they had to add more overhead, they had to add more complexity. So the benefit didn't weigh out because the benefit wasn't big enough for their size business to justify the cost of the input. And it's something you definitely want to pay attention to when you're looking at, and that's not just true of ERP, that's true of any tool that you go into, but you always want to kind of weigh that out. And if you don't know, that's where like getting a selection consultant or working with consulting and things like that really help, because they can kind of right size the solution for you. And there's other ways you can do it too. You can do automation, integration like us to even streamline things more, but there's all different ways to solve it. But you just got to make sure that the benefits that you're going to get are clear, you know what they are, and that the inputs that you're going to have to add or the overhead you're adding will make that equation work out for you.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's you need to determine what the problems you're going to solve with that, and then be able to measure did you solve them, maybe, and the extra the complexity or the reason for going to a new ERP or upgrading to the new system is like, are you going to get the bang for your buck, right? You're going to have the processes or the new features or the functionality that you're looking for. Does it solve your problem? And did you set it up to solve that? Otherwise, you're going to end up with kind of a heavy expensive paperweight.
Oh yeah. I think about what was the reason? Like I remember when I started manufacturing, like the major reason that they were looking at purchasing a system at the time is because of, I'll date myself, obviously the Y2K. That was the big push. They had an older system. They were worried about the younger people on the call here don't remember Y2K was like, people were worried about the dates changeover in the year 2000 that all the computer systems would go down. So there was a huge push to buy a lot of ERP at that time to update these old systems from the 70s and 80s that may have an issue with the dates. So that was a huge kind of a glory days of selling ERP was very simple. It was a lot easier because people had to buy them. And so the main problem they're trying to solve is like, we have a system that might break. We need to get something that's up and running. And then they kind of combine those with some aspirations of things they want to do. And I think the company that I came from, I don't know all the buying criteria, but I know that someone was like to actually get more sophisticated with like material requirements planning, to get more sophisticated with scheduling, because scheduling, we were an engineer to order company. So scheduling always ended up being a big challenge. So there's like different things that people are looking at. They're like, well, maybe this system can help us solve that perennial problem that's happening all the time, and also solve this problem of like the date issue with Y2K. And it did. I mean, there were some things that we were able to do to kind of improve that. But I think having that kind of a goal, even though not trying to have too many goals, is a really good, when you're trying to make that kind of selection, is a good way to approach it. That way you at least get something, working. You have you get some kind of like, output that you get some outcome that that's going to justify the cost of the amount of input that you're going to have to go into it. Because implementing these things, it's ERPs especially are very far reaching in the company. I mean, almost everybody except for engineers tend to use the ERP. So it ends up being a big undertaking. You have to make sure you get the benefit from it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge change management. That's when I talk to partners and customers, it's always about change management. How do you manage the change in processes, process improvements, but the change in process and having new ways in which to do the work, which requires, training, requires retraining and support because people have been doing their job the way they've been doing their job for however many years, and now that's going to change. That's going to look a little bit different. The concepts are the same, but it's different. Being a language guy, I always think about it's a little similar to like well, you might know more than one language, but going to a new language, like all the pieces of that language, like okay, it has all the same normal language pieces that you would need, right? It has grammar, it has vocabulary, it has different functions, but essentially it's a brand new language, so it like looks different, even if it's related, right? It just looks different. So it is, you have to still learn the new terms, the new, in the software world, the new screens, right? The new buttons to click. That's still all part of it. Very similar to learning, even though it's similar, it's different enough that it does require change management.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that the other part that's like people don't realize is that all these systems, I guess people don't realize is the importance of the data, right? Like I've seen this tons and tons and tons, especially with companies who want to do, especially ERP and manufacturing, is they want to have material requirements planning, and they want to have scheduling, and they want to be able to know when things are going to be due, and they want to be able to promise dates to customers and all of that stuff. And then the data tends to be the driver. I think about like, we'll go back to like, obviously it's very important to CAD talk is like, the bill of material data or the item data and, the manufacturing and what it takes to make something. All of that stuff becomes critical for any of those other functions to work, right? Like, what do I buy? Material, if I'm doing material requirements, like I have to know what the thing is made out of and what parts, what makes up the whole, which is a bill of material, right? And then like, how long does it take, who am I buying it from? And all of that stuff has to be known and accurate enough to where you trust the data to which to let the system make decisions from it. So a lot of times when we see people struggling with like ERP implementations or things like that is not because the system is necessarily bad, which is it's typically because the process or the data isn't reliable enough to which to make decisions. So therefore, like it's like we're automating, which again, a bad process or automating with bad data. The whole classic, garbage in, garbage out. And one thing that's interesting is that the idea that it's not so much the data is wrong, is that it's inconsistent. Like a saying I've said before, I really love, which is like, it's better to be consistently wrong than sporadically right. And humans in general tend to be sporadically right. Right. So humans tend to like, they get things right, but they're not consistent. So like with software tends to be very, very consistent, but not always right. Right. So if you're consistently wrong, you can adjust to that. You can say this thing, this algorithm is 20% off all the time, or it's 10% off all the time. And then we can adjust 10%. I think it's I love the golf analogy. I always hook it to the left. Well, then I aim right. I can adjust for that. All right. But if I get up to the tee box, and sometimes I hit it right, sometimes I hit it left, sometimes I hit it straight, sometimes I duff it, you can't do anything with that. But you actually can hit a pretty good round of golf if you always hit it to the left or you always slice it. You can plan for that and make adjustments to that. And that's how a lot of times data works too. So a lot of times when we talk about the value of things that we do with integration and things like that or automation is to get the data consistently consistent, right? Not necessarily accurate, but consistent. So then we can figure out like how wrong it is and make an adjustment. How can I aim right? Because I know I'm going to hit it left and be able to get down the middle of the fairway each time, as opposed to like, a person doing it and it's kind of all over the place and you have no way to plan it. And that's what happens. A lot of times people are like their data is inconsistent and therefore it's hard to plan from. And then so the data coming in is inconsistent. They can't plan for it. Then this tool kind of gets blamed for, well, that was kind of useless. And then everybody reverts back to doing manual things to get things done. And then it just kind of goes sideways over time. That's typically when I see people will have these like huge systems they bought and they spent, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for, and they're still doing it with spreadsheets or they're still doing it manually and things like that, because the data is not, they have data, but it's just inconsistent and it's hard to work with it to make any kind of, to use it for any kind of value at all. And that's like the times we try to do is like, let's automate some of that data collection and kind of make it more consistent so we can plan for that.
Yeah, I had a kind of two things I want to talk about on there. So the first is the analogy of the fitness tracker, right? So fitness trackers are ubiquitous now. So everyone, not everyone, but many people are wearing a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or Google Watch or something. And then there's always these conversations of it's measuring your, how many steps that you take. It's measuring your sleep. It's measuring all these things. There's all this talk around how accurate the Fitbit is, or how accurate the Google Watch is, or the Apple Watch. How accurate is it? How accurate is the calorie burn? How accurate are those things? And we know from research that the fitness watches, they aren't always accurate in terms of calories burned, or they're not always accurate in number of steps or any of those things. But to your point, it's that watch is consistently measuring that data the same way every single day. So it's measuring your sleep every day. It's measuring your steps every day. It's measuring your heart rate. And even if it isn't correct, because it's doing the same thing every day, day in and day out, day in and day out, you can then adjust. So for example, you say, okay, I'm trying to live a healthier lifestyle. I know I bought this device, right? Apple Watch, Google Watch, Fitbit, or whatever, and I'm getting 6,000 steps a day. Are you really getting 6,000? Doesn't, who knows, right? But we do know that if you make a change and that 6,000 goes up, because you're measuring, unless you're just cheating and just like shaking it, if you're doing the same thing every day, you're going to get 8,000, 10,000. You're directionally in the right direction. So, to your point, if you're the consistent data collection, which is what a Fitbit or any of those watches does, a consistent data collection, yeah, it's not right, absolutely right, but it's directionally right. And I know I can adjust and then I can go in that direction, right? I can go more steps or more accurate. I can tailor it more to what I need. And that gets you the results that you want, even though absolutely when you measure it, like, okay, it says I burned 10,000 calories. Like, yeah, probably not, but you burned more than you did last time. And that matters. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I think you mentioned it, is the quality of the data. One question that comes up commonly when I do demonstrations or I talk to customers who are looking at an ERP system is they'll ask, when should I do this CAD Talk integration? And it's always this question: should I do it in the beginning when I'm doing the new ERP? Should I wait for a later phase and then automate that? One of my talking points, I think, here is you're going to buy a new system. And one of the challenges with the old system that you had was the quality of the data, the consistency of the data collection. And so you're going to buy a new system, and then you're going to end up entering the data in the same way that you did your old system. Well, what was the problem with the old system? The old system was that our data collection was manual, our data collection was inconsistent, or we didn't have good data. So then you're going to have a new system where usually there's a data cleansing effort involved. And then you say, okay, now I'm going to my bill of material, which draws a lot of manufacturing, right? For purchasing, for scheduling, for figuring out the cost to make the item, in terms of labor tracking, material planning, all of that. I'm going to take this bill of material that draws so much, and I'm going to manually enter it. I'm going to do all that data collection manually. So I don't have a consistent process that's going to, or even semi-automated. Maybe you get exported here, and I do some things here, and I import it, and I have this process that's not quite as consistent. Then you have a bigger risk of saying, okay, now I have this great system that I'm going to implement, but I'm still collecting data. I'm still doing the same thing that I did before. You're not going to get different results with a different system.
Exactly right. I mean, it's that you're still sporadically right. And, using your analogy with maybe like if your Fitbit every day changed the algorithm, the Fitbit would be useless. But since the fact that the
Yeah.
algorithm is consistent, it now makes the Fitbit becomes more useful, even if the algorithm isn't correct. Because actually, I have an Aura ring and it has a similar thing, and they actually have in their data they actually tell you when the algorithm changed. So over the timeline, because you're like, well, look, I'm like overnight, I end up sleeping another half hour longer, have deeper sleep, and you're like, no, we actually measure before and then after the algorithm, because the algorithm change, it will give you an effect that looks like you did something different and you haven't. It's just the algorithm's different. So they actually note that, because the algorithm, even though now is it they say the algorithm has become more accurate, which therefore, but it's actually more accurate, but not necessarily as useful as the data that's relative.
Right.
So having the algorithm be consistently wrong is actually more useful, because of the relative measurement, as you mentioned earlier, than all of a sudden one data actually being more accurate. The value actually comes with the aggregate of the data over trends. The trending is actually the more important thing than the actual individual night itself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The consistent process and the quality of the data matters. So even though I know that sometimes folks think about, integration later or catch on, oh, I'll do that in phase two or phase three or later. I think about, and of course, you have to weigh all of these things when you're implementing a new system. You have to think about all these things, whether you should include an integration in the first go. But also think about like, well, how good is the data quality, right? What are you trying to achieve? Do you want that to start from the right foot? Do you want to get that process set so that you have good quality data, you have that information in there, or do you want to do that later? And there's a risk involved, right? There's a risk both ways. There's a risk with not doing it. There's a risk with doing it. With not doing it, it's like, well, I could get all this like inaccurate or inconsistent data in there, and that's going to be a problem. So now I got this new system with a bunch of inconsistent data, and the challenge of doing it up front, right? Of course, is like, yeah, I get that that correct, but it's like one more thing I have to do a part of the project that has a risk of, not falling off the list of things to do, right? Because as you get closer to go live, you get closer to the project end. If that wasn't something that was a priority, you did set as a priority, then it could fall off, and it could fall off, and then you don't have a successful implementation. You get back to the same issue. So there are pros and cons of both. I tend to lean towards the one and the upfront, because you're doing that work. You're doing that work. You have a new system, you get the change management already. You can piggyback on some of those things, and maybe get and then right size the scope of the project so that you can provide that consistent benefit process, and then of course improve it over time. I think that's what we talked about in the past, that kind of continuous improvement, part of our culture, but also what we recommend to customers is like, get something that's working, that's pretty good, that gives you consistent processes with quality data, and then think about, long term, how can I keep improving this, not as just a one big bang thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think if I were to say like a recommendation for implementing like any system, but not just look at like, well, can this functionality work for me? Like, look at it from beginning to the end. How am I going to get the data in a place that's consistent enough to use this functionality so it's actually useful? So you can't just look at it like, well, can I use this feature? It's like, could I use this? Do I have good enough data in a manner that I could use this feature effectively? And then if you don't, work on getting the data correct first, and then kind of adopting different areas of the system as you go. So it's like, if I'm trying to I really want to get good costing, right? Like, you'd say, well, what would be a really good way to get costing data, right? You'd say, well, in order, if I'm getting purchasing, then it's more straightforward. You're buying it from somewhere, they give you a price, you know the cost. But if you're saying I'm going to make it, I have a machine shop, or I'm trying to produce, or I'm doing assembly, like, you could, some people would say, well, it's easier. There's lots of ways you can measure that. You could do actual data collection, where you're measuring the time or the labor, or you can pull data from machines if you can. I mean, so pulling data from the machine for actual spindle time or the machines might be a little bit more accurate, because it's not human intervention. Or you could take like the time and calculate it. And there's all different ways you can do it, but like really thinking about like how you're going to collect that data, and more about its precision than its accuracy, which goes back to what we're saying is consistently wrong versus sporadically right type of thing. The precision is more important than the accuracy. And
Right.
how do you, if you're going to do it, how can you do it in the most consistent way possible, therefore that you can then adjust, right? And then, so planning the data collection and playing the data cleanliness along with the functionality you're trying to implement would give you the best chance of success. I think people are very love the outcome. They love the benefit they get, but they realize that all the benefit comes from the hard work of making sure that data has enough precision to which to actually plan and do things from. Because software really loves consistency. I mean, it really does. So like it's able to deal with that. Now that we're getting better and better with the algorithms, where we can deal with inconsistency, but AI, things like that. But at the end of the day, it loves consistency. And like, we know this, I mean, this is like even a core principle of life. It's like, you can be really, really sharp, but if you're inconsistent, it's kind of a killer, right? There's lots of smart, inconsistent people, but the guy who day in, day out just plugs away and is consistent will usually beat the smart guy every time. And that's true in software too.
Yeah, that's right. It's funny, it's like well, I mean, these systems mirror people, and we had talked about this before. Is that consistency will beat a great idea every time, right? So like you can have a great idea or be super smart or have this great tool, but if it's not consistent, it's not implemented or done in a consistent way, it's not going to provide the value that you need because it's hard to measure an inconsistency. It's a lot of noise, and you can't see you can't see a trajectory. You can't make any heads or tails of what the noise is. But getting something consistent, you can see a pattern and then make adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people get shiny object syndrome. They want all the bells and whistles, but sometimes they don't want to plan for the work to make it useful. And then that requires, kind of boring actions done consistently over time, and the same, that kind of thing.
Right.
So yeah, keep coming back to a similar theme, which is that, that a lot of these things just require, consistent effort over time. So probably the most said word in our podcast is consistency.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's also, I mean, I think what CAD Talk is trying to achieve, right? I mean, yeah, we talk about automation and we talk about better data, but it comes down to it's consistent, right? That consistent data transfer, it's consistent automation, all that consistency drives a better process improvement and gives you that ability to make decisions based upon what's happening because you can see it and it's happening all the time. Are there are there other areas? I was thinking about, are there other areas in the ERP that can be holding folks back in terms of how they do something? I was thinking about one common thing that we can hear coming up is about with ERP and jobs. How like when you create a bill of material in the ERP, when you create the work order, the job order, the shop order on the floor, you create all these sort of manufacturing jobs, right? These jobs that you have to create. And then people are always trying to shift around the bill of material to to to
Mm.
to like keep to change. I mean, how do I put this? It's kind of a complex thing. So you have a bill of material, right? You have to manufacture parts. It's an indentation, right? Different levels. When you create the actual job for the shop floor to make, they create usually what's called sub jobs or sub work orders or sub shop orders, which is a bunch of mini orders that the shop floor takes in along with the drawings and the information to manufacture this part, right? And that creates a lot of what we call sub jobs. When you do a sub job, you can collect data from the shop floor of how long it takes, on the work center, runtime, setup times, but also then at the end, you got to close that job and then say, hey, I'm going to close this job, then to allow to roll up and to finish the entire job, right? So the top level and then all those sub jobs down, and how people can
Mm-hmm.
goes back to that consistent data. They'll go back and like change the consistency of the CAD data or change the consistency of the engineering data to be different from what they normally would do in order to fix this thing on the downstream of too many sub jobs, too many jobs on the shop floor they have to close. So talk a little bit about how like those
Mm.
types of decisions can really hold back a manufacturing company in terms of like the solution. I think this would be really valuable for people about think about it differently on how to solve these other problems that can limit the effectiveness, excuse me, of the tool, ERP or even CAD Talk.
Yeah, I think I kind of consider this like the local optimization problem, right? You have the local optimization problem of everyone looks at like their little part of the equation, right? In a process. So you have, and then there's when I used to work in nesting software, they used to have this saying about like when you actually nest parts down on a sheet, like a series of good decisions can lead to a bad result, right? So you'd say, so you think that like, and theory constraints talks about this too. It's like everybody's trying to optimize their little world, but when you add all those optimizations up, it's actually the worst thing you could do. And so like just use the idea of theory constraints. If I were trying to optimize one work center, I would load it in, because the setup time is really high. I would load it up with and do a bunch of parts, and that is really really good for that work center,
Right.
local optimization, but horrible for the flow of the entire shop because that work center becomes a bottleneck and you're building a lot of inventory and then you can't get things to the shop because you're waiting for those parts to get finished before you can start other parts to complete an assembly to actually ship product, right? The same thing happens with process. So if you think about like I closing all these jobs on the shop floor is actually a huge amount of work, right? And then so we need to figure out a way to like I'm trying to local optimize. Well, I don't have time to close all those jobs. So let me kind of change around the bill of material structure. Let me do all these other things to optimize the closing of the jobs. But when you do that, you actually remove a layer of data that may or may not be useful to you, but usually it would be. Like you think about the purpose of the ERP is to track all of that to get an accurate cost, so you actually have an idea of what something is, right? So you'd say, well, just like you've had budgets, if you're creating a bunch of parts and you're like, okay, well, my cost of this thing that I make went up 20%. And you're like, well, why? Well, if I have all the individual jobs to break down all the pieces that went into that, I can drill as far all the way down to the raw material to know where the cost increase happened. But if I only have one job to make the whole thing, then I'm kind of chunk the data up in a location where it's maybe no longer useful, right? So therefore, I've locally optimized on like how do I make it easy for me to close jobs, which is local optimization for that labor of collecting the data, but therefore compromise the data I've compromised the data that I need to use for future planning. And so you've kind of given up the like why even have the like you can make an argument like, well, the ERP is actually less useful. You're locally optimized by you can kind of get in trouble like that a lot where people were locally optimized say, well, I got to figure out a way to save this step in order to, and then they do things like they actually compromise the benefit, the whole thing they're trying to get by doing that, right? So one of the things we talk about is just kind of keep your eye on the ball when you're doing these things. Is like, the problem is that closing jobs takes a lot of labor. But you don't want to compromise the data collection in order to make it easier to close jobs. So why don't we just try to figure out a way to make it easier to close jobs so you can still get the best of both worlds? You get all the data, but you also don't have the labor. And that typically tends to be kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people. That's why a lot of times we'll recommend people will see a lot of people kind of doing all these machinations with bills of material and changing the structures and trying to do reduced jobs. But it's like, how about we just leave it the way that the ERP is designed to work, and then figure out a way to to make it the ERP work faster the way it's already designed. So I think that happens a lot. People try to change the way things work as opposed to trying to speed up the way it's already designed to work. And that way, and because the benefit of that is that it's already designed that way, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel, and deal with all the bugs and all the ramifications of that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like one good tip we could take from this is like when you're doing your system, you're designing your system, is try to use it the way it was built, the way it was needed. That doesn't mean that you need to ch change how you do all your work necessarily, but how do you can get all the information into the ERP, set it up so that the way it's designed, and then look for ways to speed it up. I think we see that with CAD Talk as well. Sometimes people be like, oh, when they implement, like, can we speed this up, make it, or can we automate it all right away? And I think we say, well, we'll try to focus on, let's let it work the way it works, right? Let's set it up the way it works, and then we can speed that up. We can make it faster or make it easier, but
Mhm.
first things first, let's get it going the way it's supposed to work, and then we can optimize or speed up the other areas where it might be slow, as opposed to try to redesign everything or to do it in a way that is outside of the typical normal workflow, just to accomplish a goal. Focus on, it's a good hot tip. It's like focus on doing the process the way it's designed to go, with all of the kind of inefficiencies that you see. And then once you have that process working the way it should, the best practice, then say, okay, where are the bottlenecks and how can we eliminate those, either through automation, through customization, or some a modification, something that would help speed it up, but would still give you all the benefits that you need, rather than trying to redesign it. It's your point, because once you start redesigning it, you're off the trail, right? You're off-roading. You're off-roading, and with off-roading comes all of the issues, right? I didn't see that lake there. I didn't see that giant boulder, and I didn't see all those things. So now you're dealing with all of those issues. Well, if you just said go through the process, the normal process, and they'll try to change it, and then once you have that done, go, okay, now where are the bottlenecks? Where are the issues that we need to remove?
Yeah, that's the whole model then modify philosophy. You can't like first model, get the result, then modify it to improve it. But people try to modify before they actually model, and
Up front.
they don't understand the process. They don't understand how it all works, and then they compromise all the benefits because they really don't understand the thing that they're dealing with well enough yet to modify it. So that's
Right.
and then they end up losing all the benefit, and then they claim that the solution doesn't work. And what it is, they just actually didn't model it first correctly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good tip. Model it first. Model it first. Get it working the way
Mhm.
it's supposed to work. Not worrying too much about the inefficiencies or the bottlenecks. And the smaller bottlenecks and smaller inefficiencies. And then once that's working and it's efficient, excuse me, and it's the process is smooth and it's working that process the way it should, then look at ways to improve that, make those improvements to speed it up. Right. So that's a good tip.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Well, Scott, I mean, this was another great conversation about, some things to think about on ERP implementation, what the value is. Kind of to sum up, we talked about like, hey, kind of two things, right? The quality importance of the process and the data. So you're looking for consistency. So I think that the consistency and the modeling go together in some regard, right? So because like if you can model it in a consistent way and you can drive that consistency, from there you can make those micro improvements. So I think those kind of go hand in hand. So the two takeaways I have is first, get a consistent process going that you can measure and improve upon, and take that all the way through. So model it, do it consistently, get the data collection correct, and then after that, make the improvements, the micro improvements elsewhere that can add up to, getting to where you want to be versus trying to figure out in the front end how I'm going to get there with some new idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great way to look at it.
Well, Scott, man, this is great. Another great conversation. Kind of again a bit nerdy, but I think these conversations are good. Hopefully, they provide value to people who are looking at ERP, people who are looking at their processes. Cat Talk is really designed to be, an engineering to manufacturing handoff automation. We take the stuff from the information from CAD, PDM, and PLM and to bring it into ERP. We're really talking about like since we work with all those different systems, where do we see commonalities across customers, across different platforms, and try to help our listeners map their way through their processes and give them really frameworks or tools for thinking so that when they make decisions, they can make the best ones at the time, whether they use, Cat Talk or not, right? But just in general, for having the most success. So I don't have anything else, Scott. Anything else you'd like to leave the listeners with?
No, not at all. I think just obviously leave a comment if you have thoughts on this. I mean, there's like we're definitely trying to get more engagement. We're just get like I love to see the comments. We on the last episode we got some comments. It was nice seeing those, and it gives us feedback on how helpful these ideas are, and just kind of seeing what people hope it's helping people when they're going through these processes and trying to make improvements or implementing ERP or trying to help their businesses. Like we really want to get feedback and let us know what's resonated with you, so we know kind of what we should do more of and what we should do less of.
Yeah, I'll echo that. So like and subscribe and comment and tell us what you want to listen. You want more of. I'd be excited to hear where the challenges are people are having, where we could add value in terms of sharing our knowledge. So I look forward to another conversation next week, Scott. And again, just to remind everybody, we're CAD Talk Software, and you can find us at CAD Talk. We have a lot of good content there, blogs and other information. So feel free to visit the site. And Scott, we will see you next time.